interference in Africa started with slavery. When slavery had lost its value, it graduated into colonization. And that is the context in which Berlin must be seen, when the European powers sat in Berlin and divided the continent of Africa into spheres of influence. When colonization had lost its luster through a combination of certain realities and agitation from the continent, we regained our independence. But as John Henry Clark, that great African-American, said, we regained independence by mimicking European governance systems. And he rightly says, no African country will ever succeed on the basis of those systems.
The Scramble for Africa refers to the rapid colonization and division of nearly the entire African continent by European powers between 1884 and 1914. In just a few decades, Africa was transformed from a continent largely independent of European control into one carved up by imperial powers such as Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy. The driving force behind the imperial conquest were complex, a mix of economic ambition, national rivalry, racial ideology, and missionary zeal. As the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes once declared, we must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies. The Scramble for Africa was not just a geopolitical event, it was a reshaping of the African world. Its legacy continues to echo in the modern political, social, and economic structure of the continent. The late 19th century was an age of intense industrialization in Europe. Factories demanded raw materials such as cotton, rubber, palm oil, copper, and gold, while new markets were needed to sell manufactured goods. Technological advances facilitated European expansion overseas, as industrialization brought about rapid advancements in transport and communication, especially in the form of steamships, railway, and telegraphs. Medical advances also played an important role, especially medicines for tropical diseases, which helped control their adverse effects. The development of quinine, an effective treatment for malaria, made vast expanses of the tropics more accessible for Europeans. By 1841, businessmen from Europe had established small trading posts along the coast of Africa, but they seldom moved inland, preferring to stay near the sea. They primarily traded with locals. Large parts of the continent were essentially uninhabitable for Europeans because of their high mortality rates for tropical diseases such as malaria. In the middle of the 19th century, European explorers mapped much of East Africa and Central Africa. However, for many European powers, colonies symbolized prestige and power. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who initially showed little interest in Africa, later admitted that we are not in Africa for our own benefit, but because of the demands of competition with other nations. The Scramble for Africa territory didn't just showcase the European needs for raw material, but also reflected concerns for the acquisition of military and naval bases for the strategic purpose of the exercise of power. Colonies were seen as assets in balance of power negotiations, useful as items of exchange at times of trading bargaining. Colonies with large native population were also a source of military power. Britain and France used large numbers of British, Indian, and North African soldiers, respectively, in many of their colonial wars, and will do so again in the coming world wars. The formalization of the Scramble occurred at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, convened by Bismarck to regulate European colonization in Africa and avoid wars between imperial powers. No African representatives were invited. The conference codified the principle of effective occupation, meaning that to claim a territory, an European power had to demonstrate actual control over it. Representatives from 14 countries from Europe and beyond attended the conference, though only half of them, Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Portugal, Italy, and Spain, already had or would go on to have recognized colonial holdings in Africa. The conference resolved the immediate issue of Leopold's claim by recognizing Congo Free State as being under his control, though he was required to agree to free trade along rivers in his territory. The occupation of Egypt and the acquisition of the Congo were the first major moves in what came to be the procedure scramble of African territory. As late as the 1970s, Europeans controlled approximately 10% of the African continent, with all their territories located near the coast. The most important holdings were Angola and Mozambique, held by Portugal, the Cape Colony, held by United Kingdom, and Algeria, held by France. Following the conference, the map of Africa was withdrawn to suit European interests, cutting across ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines. This arbitrary division would later fuel many of Africa's internal conflicts in the post-colonial era. By 1914, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained outside European control, with the former eventually being occupied by Italy in 1936, while the latter having strong connections with its historical colonizers, the United States. European powers justified the scramble for Africa using a combination of ideological, economic, religious, and pseudo-scientific arguments that made imperial conquest seem both necessary and noble in their eyes. These justifications served to mark the true motivation of economic exploitation and geographical dominance. The French believed their culture, language, education, law, and secular values was the highest form of civilization. Their goal was to assimilate Africans into French culture until they became French by identity. This ideology was popularly known as the policy of assimilation. Its key features were assimilation policy, which meant Africans could theoretically gain French citizenship if they adopted French customs, language, and laws. Secular republicanism, meaning they would be free Africans from superstitions and convert them into modern, rational, and secular thoughts. Cultural transformation, which replaced indigenous system with French schools, bureaucracy, and cultures. This created a hierarchy where European cultures were seen as superior and African cultures as inferior. Also similar to the French civilizing mission, the British white man's burden, popularized by Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem. This idea portrayed colonization as a burden placed on white men to help less developed races, and their goal was to indoctrinate Africans into the Christian faith and provide guidance to Africa as they were seen as childlike who needed guidance and discipline. The economic system of colonial Africa was designed for extraction, not development. Roads, railways, and ports were built to transport raw materials to Europe, not to integrate African economies. Economically, European powers transformed African societies into extraction-based economies focused on supplying raw materials such as rubber, gold, and cash crop to European industries. Local manufacturing and traditional industries were deliberately suppressed, turning African markets into consumers of European goods rather than their competitive producers. Infrastructures like railways and ports was constructed primarily to transport resources to the coast for export, offering little benefits to the internal development. The widespread use of forced labor and exploitation generated immense wealth for Europe, while leaving African economies underdeveloped and dependent long after independence. Politically, colonial rule imposed arbitrary borders that ignored ethics, cultural, and linguistic realities. These artificial borders placed rival groups within the same states and split unified communities across different colonies, creating tension and later contributed to the many post-independence conflicts and civil wars. Indigenous political systems and powerful kingdoms were dismantled, replaced with foreign models of governance that lacked legitimacy among local population. Colonial administration often relied on force and divide and rule tactics, empowering select ethnic groups over others and deepening social diversion. As a result, newly independent African nations inherited weak political institutions, ethnic rivalries, and authoritarian traditions. As Chinua Achebe would later reflect in Things Fall Apart, the white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. Achebe's world captured the psychological dimension of colonization, the gradual erosion of identity and unity. The scramble for Africa came to an end in the mid-20th century as African nationalism grew and European power weakened after the Second World War. Independence movements, inspired by global anti-colonial sentiments, demanded self-rule and challenged the moral and economic foundations of empires. By the 1960s, most African nations had formally achieved political independence, bringing the period of direct colonial domination to a close. However, the departure of European powers did not erase the deep structural changes imposed during the colonial rule. Today, Africa still grapples with the scars of partition, borders drawn in ignorance, economies shaped by extraction, and political system modeled after foreign power. The enduring legacy of the scramble continues to shape Africa's political and economic landscape. Artificial borders drawn in Europe without the African consultation created states filled with ethnic tension and competitive identities. Moreover, Europe's ideological justification for colonization, such as the civilizing mission and the claim of racial superiority, left long-lasting psychological and cultural effects, influencing perceptions of African identity and global power relations. In essence, while the scramble for Africa ended with political independence, its legacy endures through economic dependency, political instability, and unresolved social division. The consequences of this period remain central to understanding Africa's contemporary struggles and efforts towards development and integration.